There once was a man whom everyone respected in the city. During the day, he was a police officer. At night, he was a criminal. And no one knew they were the same person. This is the story of how a man lived a double life for 24 years, and what happened when he was finally caught. Prepare yourself, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about how well you know the people you meet every day. Captain James Morrison was an imposing figure in the British capital. 48 years old, tall, strongly built man who had served with the Metropolitan Police for 25 years. His colleagues trusted him, locals respected him, and criminals feared him. During the day, he worked at New Scotland Yard, and he had a reputation as the most honest detective in the district. But what no one knew about Captain Morrison was that at night, he became a completely different person. On that October evening when everything began, James was investigating a burglary case. The victim was an elderly woman whose every valuable possession had been stolen. The woman sobbed as she told him how precious those family jewels were to her. James listened, took notes, comforted the woman. He promised to do everything possible to find the perpetrators, and he truly did everything. Just not in the way the woman thought. That night, James returned to the apartment, not for an official visit, but to take away the remaining valuables that the earlier burglars had failed to steal. He knew exactly where the hiding places were, because he had questioned the woman that afternoon. This wasn't the first time. James had been living a double life for 16 years. During the day, he caught criminals. At night, he was the one he should have been looking for. But how did an honest police officer get to this point? The story began 26 years earlier, when James was still a young constable. During a late evening patrol, he received an alert about a burglary. When he arrived at the scene, it was already too late. The thieves had escaped, but they had left something behind, a bag full of money and jewelry. James knew he should report the find, but then he thought of his wife, who had been asking for months to finally buy a new car. They had 2 children who needed clothes for school, and James's salary barely covered the expenses. He hesitated for just a moment. Then he pocketed the money and never reported it. This was the first step over the edge of the cliff, and after the first step, the second was easy, then the third, and so on, for 26 years. James learned that police work was the perfect cover story for crime. He knew when and where burglaries would happen. He knew which houses contained valuables, and most importantly, he knew how to avoid getting caught. He carried out every crime in such a way that it couldn't be connected to him. He never worked at night in his own district, never in places where he would have led the investigation, and he always used methods that didn't point to his police training. James was an exemplary family man at home. His wife, Margaret, worked at an accounting firm and had no idea about her husband's double life. She knew that James sometimes worked night shifts, and this seemed perfectly normal to her. They had 2 children. Michael, the 22-year-old son who was studying at medical school, and Sarah, the 19-year-old daughter who wanted to become a lawyer. James was proud of them and did everything possible to secure their future. Ironically, Sarah often talked with her father about law and justice. "Dad, how can you stand dealing with criminals every day?" she asked once. James smiled. "You know, sweetheart, the world isn't black and white. There's good and bad in every person. Our job is to find the balance." Sarah nodded, not knowing how deeply true her father's answer was. But James's story was only the first chapter of a much more complicated novel. In Prague, on that cold November morning when Sergeant Tomáš Novotný received his transfer to the downtown precinct, He thought this would be the pinnacle of his career. He was 36 years old, had served with the Czech police for 10 years, and had always dreamed of working in the heart of the capital. Tomáš was a different man than James. Shorter, thinner, wore glasses. But there was something in his gaze that revealed this man saw everything and knew everything. His colleagues quickly realized that Tomáš possessed special abilities. He solved cases that others had been trying to crack for months. But Tomáš also had a secret. He didn't use his investigative skills exclusively for the police force. Tomáš had been working for years with an elite gang of thieves who stole the most expensive artworks and jewelry from Prague's wealthiest families. Tomáš's job wasn't the theft itself. His job was to ensure that investigations never led to results. Every time the gang planned another operation, Tomáš knew in advance when and where the burglary would take place. He knew which investigators would get the case, and he knew how to mislead the investigation without arousing suspicion. Tomáš's methods were more sophisticated than James's. He never stole personally. Instead, he sold information, left false clues, and wrote reports that led investigators in the wrong direction. "The art is in never doing it yourself," he explained once to the gang leader Pavel. "If you steal the objects yourself, sooner or later they'll catch you. But if you're the one leading the investigation, they'll never suspect you." Tomáš's home life was also completely normal. He lived with his wife Jana in a small apartment in the Vinohrady district. Jana was a teacher and passionately told him about school events every evening. "Tomáš, is something wrong?" Jana asked one evening when she saw her husband looking particularly troubled. "Nothing special, darling. Just working on a complicated case, an art theft series. These thieves are very clever." Jana smiled reassuringly. "I'm sure you'll catch them. You always catch the criminals." Tomáš smiled back, but deep in his heart, he knew the truth. He was the one ensuring the criminals would never be caught. The Czech officer's case was even stranger than the Englishman's, because Tomáš actually enjoyed the double game. James had started crime out of necessity to support his family, but Tomáš did it because he found it exciting to outsmart the system. "Every game is decided in the details," he often said. And he knew all the details. He knew how the investigation protocol worked. He knew his colleagues' weaknesses, and he knew how to use this knowledge for his own purposes. But every game has an end, and Tomáš's game's end was approaching, even if he didn't know it. In Budapest, on that rainy December afternoon when Detective Inspector Ferenc Kovács received his promotion to the National Investigation Bureau, he thought his dreams were coming true. He was 41 years old, had served with the police for 18 years, and had finally reached a position where he could make real changes. Ferenc was a different man than James and Tomáš. Higher ranking, with more responsibility, and access to much more information. This also meant many more opportunities. Ferenc's specialty was fighting organized crime. He knew how large criminal networks operated. He was familiar with money laundering methods, and he knew exactly which groups were planning major operations, when and where. But Ferenc had different plans for this knowledge. Instead of dismantling the criminal networks, Ferenc made deals with them. He received money in exchange for information. Not small amounts. Huge sums that allowed him to live at a standard that could never have been financed from a police officer's salary. Ferenc lived in a downtown Budapest penthouse, drove an expensive car, and vacationed in places his colleagues could never have afforded. When someone asked where all his money came from, he always gave the same answer. "I invest well in the stock market." The reality was that Ferenc met with a man every month in a discreet cafe near the Danube. This man, who only introduced himself as Mr. Sabo, paid Ferenc huge sums to know in advance when the police were planning raids. "Ferenc, you're our best investment," Mr. Sabo said on one occasion. "With a good bribe, we can avoid the damage a raid would cause." Ferenc nodded in agreement. To him, this seemed like a perfectly logical business. The criminals would continue their activities anyway. At least he profited from it. And no one got hurt in this process. Only those people didn't go to prison who belonged there anyway. Ferenc lived a lonely life at home. He was divorced, his 2 children lived with his ex-wife, and he rarely saw them. Perhaps this also contributed to how easily he got involved in corruption. There was no one to whom he had to explain his decisions. Interestingly, when Ferenc started making corrupt deals, he didn't even think it was real crime. He saw himself as a businessman who took advantage of opportunities. Police work was just a cover story for him, which he maintained to access information. In the modern world, everything is about information, he often said. And I have access to the best information. But Ferenc didn't take into account that information is a double-edged sword, and that the people he was getting money from were much more dangerous than he thought. If you found this story interesting so far, then wait, because now comes the real twist. The 3 men's lives were about to intersect, and what had to happen next, no one could have foreseen. Ferenc continued his double life in Budapest when one day he received an unexpected phone call. The caller spoke Hungarian with a Czech accent and said his name was Tomáš Novotný, sergeant from the Prague police. "Captain Kovács, I would like to meet with you about a mutual case," Tomáš said. Ferenc was surprised. "What kind of case?" "An international art theft gang case. It seems they've also been active in your district." Ferenc felt his heart beating faster. Could it be possible they had discovered his activities? But Tomáš's voice was calm, and nothing suggested he suspected anything. "Of course, colleague. When and where can we meet?" A week later, Ferenc traveled to Prague. The meeting was in a quiet restaurant in the city center. Tomáš was punctual. Ferenc was already waiting for him at the table. "Thank you for coming," Tomáš said as he sat down. "I think we can help each other mutually." During the conversation, Ferenc realized that Tomáš wasn't who he appeared to be. He knew too much about criminal methods. He knew too precisely those details that only an experienced criminal could know. And Tomáš also noticed something about Ferenc. The Hungarian police officer was too interested in how to avoid detection. He asked questions that suggested he had more knowledge than an honest police officer should have. By the end of dinner, both had figured out the truth, but neither said it out loud. "It was interesting talking with you, Captain," Tomáš said as they paid. "I think so too, Sergeant," Ferenc replied. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation another time." Tomáš smiled. "I'm sure we will continue it." 3 months later, Tomáš visited Budapest, not on official business, but to meet with Ferenc. This time they spoke openly about their situation. Ferenc told how everything had started 18 years ago. Tomáš revealed that he had been working with the Prague art theft gang for years. "You know, Captain, I think we could be much more effective together," Tomáš said. "What do you have in mind?" "Imagine it. 2 police officers in 2 countries. We could exchange information, help each other's work, and of course the other work too." Ferenc thought about it. The proposal was tempting. Tomáš's connections and experience could have helped him a lot. "And what guarantee do we have that we won't betray each other?" Ferenc asked. Tomáš laughed. "The fact, Captain, that we both have something to lose. If I betray you, you can betray me. That's the perfect insurance. Ferenc agreed. And thus was born the first international police-criminal partnership in Central Europe. Over the following months, Ferenc and Tomáš regularly maintained contact. They exchanged information, helped each other's work, and coordinated their activities so cleverly that no one suspected them. Ferenc, through Prague connections, gained access to artworks he never could have obtained in Budapest. Tomáš, with Ferenc's help, extended his activities to Hungary as well. Everything worked perfectly, until Inspector James Morrison entered the picture. James had nothing to do with the two Central European officers. He moved in London's more expensive districts, hunted much bigger fish, but fate brought it about that one of the criminal groups he protected made contact with Tomáš's Prague gang. The first signal came when one of James's informants mentioned a Hungarian Czech art theft group that was starting to operate internationally. This is interesting, James thought. He had never encountered a criminal network where police officers also participated. James began investigating, not officially, of course. He wanted to use the information for his own purposes. Within a few weeks, he discovered Ferenc and Tomáš's true identities, but instead of reporting them, he had another idea. James called Tomáš. "Sergeant Novak, this is James Morrison from Scotland Yard. I would like to meet with you." Tomáš went pale. "Why?" "Because I think we have things to discuss, and I also think we could all profit from such a conversation." Tomáš understood that James wasn't calling to arrest him. If that had been his purpose, he wouldn't have called ahead. The meeting was in Vienna, neutral ground for all three men. They sat down in an elegant hotel bar at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. James was surprisingly open. He told them he was also a corrupt police officer and had been working with various criminal groups for years. He suggested they form a three-way alliance. "Imagine it," James said. 3 police officers in 3 countries. With our information and connections, we could build a network like the world has never seen. Ferenc and Tomáš looked at each other. The proposal exceeded even their own imagination. "And what would be the division of tasks?" Ferenc asked. "Simple," James replied. "You, Captain, continue with traditional burglaries and thefts in Hungary. Sergeant Tomáš continues with art thefts in the Czech Republic, and I coordinate the entire network and ensure international connections." Tomáš thought about it. "And what guarantee do we have that we won't betray each other?" James smiled. "The same as you two had. Mutual insurance. If any of us betrays another, all 3 of us will be caught." By the end of the meeting, all 3 men had agreed to the alliance. They even signed a written agreement, naturally with false names. This was the moment when a local Hungarian criminal, a Czech art thief, and a London corrupt police officer united their forces. This was the moment when everything changed. Their first joint operation took place a month later. The target was a wealthy Austrian businessman who owned a famous art collection in Vienna. James obtained the information about the man. He knew when he traveled away from home. He knew the details of the alarm system, and he knew which insurance company covered the artworks. Tomáš organized the actual theft. He selected the Czech thieves, developed the plan, and ensured that the Prague police wouldn't find any leads. Ferenc's task was to secure the transport route through Hungary. He knew which police officers worked at which checkpoints, and he knew how to avoid getting caught. The operation was perfectly successful. The stolen artworks were transported through Prague and Budapest to London, where James's people sold them. The profit obtained by the three men exceeded 2 million euros. Each of them earned more money in 1 week than they would in a year of honest police work. "This is just the beginning," James said after the successful operation. "Now you know what we're capable of together." Ferenc and Tomáš agreed. This was the first time they had achieved profit that truly changed their lives. But the intoxicating feeling of success clouded their rational thinking. They didn't notice that every successful operation increased the risk. They didn't notice that the larger their network grew, the more vulnerable they became at more points. And they didn't notice that someone had been watching them since their first operation. Dr. Emma Williams was a Scottish detective who specialized in international art theft cases at Interpol. 28 years old, extremely intelligent, and she had already solved cases that others considered hopeless. Emma first heard about the three-way alliance when she participated in the investigation following the Viennese art theft. Something didn't add up about how the theft had happened. It was too precise, too well coordinated. And most importantly, the thieves had access to information that only police officers could have obtained. "This isn't a traditional art theft gang," Emma told her colleague, Detective Martin Dubois. "Someone is helping them from the inside." Emma began investigating. Not officially, of course. Interpol couldn't deal with cases where there wasn't concrete suspicion of police corruption. But Emma continued the investigation as a private citizen, in her spare time, at her own expense, at her own risk. Within 3 months, she had figured out Ferenc, Tomáš, and James's true activities, but she had no proof. Everything she found was only suspicious, but not enough for charges. Emma knew she had to approach the problem differently. If she wanted to get evidence, she had to infiltrate their network. Emma made a decision. She assumed a false identity and contacted one of James's known criminal partners. She pretended to be a corrupt investigator who wanted to sell information. This was the beginning of the long game that would eventually cause all three men's downfall. Emma's plan was simple. Infiltrate the network, gather evidence, then expose all three. But she didn't expect how complicated this process would be. The first meeting was in a London pub. Emma introduced herself as Charlotte Williams and claimed to be a corrupt detective with the Manchester police. "What kind of information do you have access to?" James asked suspiciously. "Drug raid schedules, witness protection program details, international arrest warrants," Emma replied confidently. James began to take interest. If this woman could really provide what she claimed, she could be extremely valuable to him. "And what do you want in return?" "Money. Lots of money. And integration into your network." James was cautious. "What network are you talking about?" Emma smiled. "Mr. Morrison, I know you're not just a simple corrupt police officer. I know you have international connections, and I know you have partners in Central Europe." James went pale. "How do you know that?" "In my work, I've come across certain information. Prague and Budapest police sources. Sources who are also flexible about ethical questions." James realized this woman was much more dangerous than he had thought, but she could also be much more valuable. "All right, I'll talk to my partners. But if it turns out you're lying..." Emma interrupted. "Mr. Morrison, we're all lying. The question is how useful our lies are to each other." James agreed to the trial period. Over the next week, Emma provided him with 3 pieces of information that were genuinely valuable. Of course, these pieces of information related to cases that weren't important to Emma. When James saw that Emma's information was real, he decided to introduce her to the network. But first he wanted to consult Ferenc and Tomáš's opinion. The next meeting was again in Vienna. Emma also participated. "Ladies and gentlemen," James began, "I'd like to introduce Charlotte Williams. She will be our 4th member." Ferenc looked at Emma skeptically. "How do we know we can trust her?" "The same way you know you can trust each other," Emma replied. "Mutual threat. If I betray you, you betray me. Perfect balance." Tomáš asked a different question. "What can you add to our network?" "Access to information you could never obtain, federal agency databases, details of international investigations, and most importantly, we can know in advance who will hunt us and when." The 3 men looked at each other. Emma's offer was tempting. "However, I have one condition," Emma continued. "I want a big operation, something that shows our capabilities, and something that brings serious profit." James was interested. "What do you have in mind?" "The British Museum. It houses one of the world's most valuable art collections, and I know every detail of the security system." The 3 men's breath caught. The British Museum? This would be an operation that would make headlines worldwide. This is too risky," Ferenc said. Emma shook her head. "Risky for those who don't know the details. But if the 4 of us plan it together, it will be perfect." Tomáš looked at her with interest. "What kind of details do you know?" Emma pulled out a folder. "Every security protocol, every guard's shift schedule, every alarm system's technical specifications, and most importantly, every point where you can break in without being noticed." James looked through the documents. What he saw was incredible. Emma had access to details that even he couldn't obtain after years at Scotland Yard. "Where did you get these?" James asked. "Connections," Emma replied diplomatically, "and a lot of patience." The reality was that Emma had spent months mapping the British Museum's security system, not to rob it, but to set a trap for the 3 men. Emma knew that if she came up with a big enough temptation, the 3 men wouldn't be able to resist, and the British Museum was the perfect temptation. It was about such profit that would have meant lifelong wealth for all of them. "How long would it take to organize?" Tomáš asked. 6 weeks, Emma replied. "That's how long we need to learn the staff shift changes and make technical preparations." Ferenc was still skeptical. "And what if we get caught?" Emma looked at him confidently. "Captain Kovács, you've been conducting illegal activities for 26 years without getting caught. Sergeant Tomáš has been misleading official investigations for years. Inspector Morrison has been selling information that could get him life imprisonment. You've all already passed the point where safety matters." This was the argument that convinced them. Emma was telling the truth. All 3 were already too deep to step back. "All right," James said finally. "Let's do it." Over the next 6 weeks, Emma did everything to make the 3 men trust her. She provided them with information that was genuinely valuable. Of course, these were cases that didn't affect her real investigation. But meanwhile, Emma documented every detail. She recorded every meeting. She wiretapped every phone conversation, and she tracked every financial transaction. Emma's goal wasn't just to expose the 3 men. Her goal was to gather evidence that had no defense against it. The day of the British Museum robbery was planned for December 15th. This was the closing day of the year's last major exhibition, when the museum also displayed particularly valuable pieces. Emma double-checked every detail. She knew this would be her only chance to catch all 3 red-handed. But there was one thing Emma hadn't counted on. Ferenc, Tomáš, and James weren't stupid. They also felt that something wasn't right. "You know," Ferenc said that evening when the four met for the last time before the operation, "something is developing strangely about all this." "What do you mean?" Emma asked, though she knew what. "Charlotte Williams, you know the systems too well. Your recruitment was too easy, and you're taking too big a risk for someone who claims to be cautious." Tomáš nodded. "I feel something too, but I don't know what." James thought about it. Maybe we're being overly paranoid. Or maybe... "Maybe what, Inspector Morrison?" Emma asked. James looked directly into her eyes. "Maybe you're not who you say you are." At that moment, Emma knew the game was over, but not as she had planned. "Gentlemen," Emma said slowly, "I think you all know too much." Ferenc jumped up from his chair. "You're an undercover detective." Emma didn't deny it. "Dr. Emma Williams, Interpol, and you're all under arrest." The moment Emma said these words, all the restaurant doors opened. Dozens of police officers rushed in, all armed. Ferenc, Tomáš, and James looked at each other for a moment. 26 years, 17 years, and 18 years of secret criminal activity ended in that moment. "Ferenc Kovács, Tomáš Novotný, James Morrison, you are all under arrest on suspicion of multiple criminal offenses," Emma said in an official voice. Ferenc was the first to speak. "How long have you known about us?" 8 months, Emma replied. "But I've only been gathering evidence for 3 months." Tomáš laughed bitterly. "And we thought we were smart." James just sat quietly. He knew everything was over. After the arrest, Emma said one more thing to them. "You know, gentlemen, your biggest mistake wasn't becoming criminals. Your biggest mistake was thinking no one was smart enough to figure you out. Ferenc, Tomáš, and James were sent to different prisons. Ferenc got 22 years in Budapest. Tomáš got 18 years in Prague. And James got life imprisonment in London, because people had also died in his cases. But this wasn't the end of the story. Margaret, James's wife, never learned about her husband's true activities. The official version was that James went to prison for corruption. The family fell apart. Michael left medical school, and Sarah moved abroad. Jana, Tomáš's wife, lost her job when her husband's true occupation came to light. She moved to a small village where no one knew her story. James's ex-wife and children didn't need an explanation. They had known for years that James wasn't an honest man. For them, the arrest was more of a relief. Dr. Emma Williams's career soared after solving the case. She became a member of Interpol's leadership and one of the leading experts in fighting international police corruption. But Emma never forgot the lesson this case taught her. The best criminals are those no one would suspect, she often told her colleagues. And the most dangerous are those who stand on the side of the law. The news of the case, of course, couldn't be made completely public. The Hungarian, Czech, and British authorities agreed to only release the most necessary details. But those people who participated in the investigation never forgot this case. Because this was the first time 3 police officers from different countries formed the core of an international criminal network. In Ferenc's early years in prison, he often thought about what would have happened if he had never pocketed that money 26 years ago. What would have happened if he had remained an honest police officer? But over time, he realized that money wasn't the problem. The problem was that he never understood what service truly meant. Not serving the police uniform, but serving those people for whom you are responsible. Tomáš took a different path in prison. He never regretted his decisions. He said he just exploited the system's flaws. The system was corrupt. I just adapted to it, he used to say. James was the only one who completely regretted his decisions. Not because he got caught, but because he realized what he had lost. His children, respect, and most importantly, his self-respect. But the most shocking detail in the entire story was something Emma only learned years later. Ferenc, Tomáš, and James never really knew each other. All three thought different things about the other two than what reality was. Ferenc thought Tomáš was an experienced international criminal who had been operating for decades. The reality was that Tomáš had only started corrupt activities 4 years ago and was an amateur in every respect. Tomáš thought Ferenc was a local Hungarian mafia leader who posed as a police officer. The reality was that Ferenc was never connected to organized crime groups and worked alone. James thought he controlled the entire network, and the other two were his employees. The reality was that all three men were independent and only worked together in situations created by Emma. This is the cruelest part of the entire case, Emma said years later at a conference. 3 people destroyed their lives for an alliance that never really existed. This story is so special because it shows how easily people whose profession should be to protect us from criminals can become criminals themselves. Ferenc led this double life for 26 years. During the day, he caught criminals. At night, he was the one he should have been looking for. And no one noticed. Not his colleagues, not his family, not those people who respected and trusted him. This shows how well we can hide even from ourselves. Ferenc could probably convince himself for years that what he was doing wasn't real crime, that he was just taking advantage of opportunities, that he was still a good person making bad decisions. Tomáš's case was different. He consciously chose corruption. For him, this was a game he enjoyed. Outsmarting the system was exciting for him, and he was proud of his abilities. James thought he was a businessman. Not a criminal, just someone who recognized good business opportunities. Information was a commodity for him, and he just sold this commodity. All 3 men rationalized their activities differently, but the result was the same. All 3 betrayed the oath they took as police officers. All 3 cheated those people who trusted them. And all 3 destroyed their own lives and their families' lives. The saddest part of the story is perhaps that all 3 were talented police officers. If they had worked honestly, they all could have had excellent careers. Ferenc was an outstanding investigator. Tomáš, a brilliant analyst. James, a born leader. But they chose. And their choices had consequences. Dr. Emma Williams still works at Interpol today. She has since solved dozens of similar cases, but none was as complex as Ferenc, Tomáš, and James's case. This case taught me that corruption isn't simply about money, Emma says. Corruption is about people forgetting why they became police officers. They forget who they owe responsibility to, and they forget what it truly means to serve. Emma still receives letters from Ferenc, who is still in prison. Ferenc is writing a book about the case and wants Emma to help him show others how an honest person can become a criminal. I don't want to write it as an excuse, Ferenc writes in one of his letters, but as a warning, so others don't make the same mistake. Tomáš never wrote to Emma. He still maintains he did nothing wrong. In prison, he committed various violations, and his sentence was extended. James attempted suicide in prison but survived. Today, he is being treated for depression in a prison psychiatric facility. His family never visited him and probably never will. This story teaches us that every decision has consequences. Ferenc's decision to pocket that money 26 years ago eventually destroyed his life and his family's life. Tomáš's decision to enjoy outsmarting the system landed him in prison. James's decision to treat information as a commodity nearly cost him his life. But the story also teaches that it's never too late to change. Emma still believes that Ferenc could be a good person if he were released from prison. A person is not what they did, but what they do next, Emma says. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson. It doesn't matter what mistakes we made in the past. What matters is what we do today and tomorrow. The story of Ferenc, Tomáš, and James is a warning for all of us. A warning about how easy it is to lose those values we believe in, how easy it is to forget who we really are, and how hard it is to find our way back if we once got lost. But the story is also hope. Hope that every person is capable of change. Hope that mistakes can be corrected. And hope that truth always wins in the end. If this story touched you, share it with others too. Because the best lessons are those we share with each other, and the best warnings are those we receive in time. Dr. Emma Williams still works on cases where police officers become criminals. This is a never-ending battle, she says. But every time we succeed in exposing a corrupt police officer, the world becomes a little safer for those who believe in justice. And this is perhaps the most important message from Ferenc, Tomáš, and James's story. That there will always be people like Emma who fight for justice. There will always be people who don't give up, even when the situation seems hopeless. The man who was both a police officer and a criminal was actually three men. Three men who, for different reasons, in different ways, but stepped onto the same path. And three men who learned that truth always comes out sooner or later.